So this is the question of life after death. So far, the basic assumption was, uh, death is a, blank experience, total annihilation. So far, we assume life after death uh, is not possible, or, death simply means total annihilation. And uh, that is why some people, they believe we should fear death because when we die, for eternity, we've been deprived of all the goods of conscious life. And uh, some people, like, Epicure, they believe, no, we shouldn't fear death because when we die, there is no one left to experience the harm of death, if any, right? So uh, now we need to come back to that, initial assumption that whether or not life after death is possible. Now, remember, right now I'm asking about the possibility of life after death, not necessarily the probability of life after death. In other words, I want to know whether or not, logically speaking or metaphysically speaking, it is possible to live after bodily death. Let me give you an example to see the difference. For example, let's say if I ask you whether or not unicorn is possible, what would be your answer? It's very improbable, but it is possible, right? Now, let me ask you this question. My friend John is a bachelor who has the most beautiful wife. Do you think John is a possible person? The unicorn is a possible person, but it is very, unlikely, very improbable, being. Now, how about, Alec, who is a student at Moravian College? Is it a possible state of affair? Alex being a student at Moravian College.
Yes.
Is it probable? Because Alec is here. We know it is the case, right? So sometimes things are, metaphysically speaking, they are possible, but in reality, they are very unlikely, improbable. Sometimes they are metaphysically impossible, and if they are impossible, means their existence is zero. The probability of their existence is zero. And sometimes, things that are metaphysically possible and physically uh, their existence is quite probable. And sometimes, in the case of Alex, being a student at Moravian College, it is certain, right? So here we are asking a question of possibility, right? The question is whether or not we can survive our bodily death. Let's say I die. So based on all those, criteria we discussed before, you pronounce me as dead, right? For example, let's say based on, brain death criteria, you pronounce me dead. So is it possible for me as who I am to continue my existence after my bodily death? So the question, will we survive our bodily death, actually, to some extent is, whether this kind of survival, that is, your survival, personal survival after your bodily death is possible. And if it is possible, in what form it might be, it might happen, right? Now, the main important point here is the question of personal identity. There are different ways one's life can continue after person's bodily death. For example, who knows, according to some uh, branches of Hinduism, when I die, my soul, my consciousness, the defining part of my existence joins to a cosmic consciousness and dissolves in that, you know, uh, cosmic consciousness. It loses all its individuality. So, in a sense, I uh, survive my bodily death in one form of existence, but in fact, it is not I who survive. I as a person uh, uh, who exists right now, here, right now, did not survive. Is it possible for me as a person identifiable right now, here, whether or not I can survive my bodily death? If we want to answer this question of personal life after bodily death, then it seems that we have to ask another question. What is the thing that makes you the person you are, right? And then we need to ask, let's say that thing that makes me the person I am, let's call it X, something, right? Now we want to know, as soon as you know what that X is, then you can ask yourself whether or not uh, that X can survive my bodily death, right? So in order to answer this question, whether or not we can survive our bodily death, the more urgent question we need to address is, what is the thing that makes us the person we are? What is that X? And then we can see whether or not that X can survive our bodily death. So that is called the question of personal identity. The question of personal identity. That is, what makes me the person that I am? What kind of changes could I survive? And what kind of changes would destroy me? For example, let's say if he changes, his shirt, still is the same person. If he gets a haircut, new haircut, he's still the same person, right? What if, uh, he permanently loses all his memories? Do you think he's still the same person? This is a tough question. Some people might say yes, some people might say no. What if, we transplant someone else's brain into Alex's body? In that case, can we say he is still Alex? That might not be the case. In other words, there are some changes we go through and we survive those changes, right? Even though at some level we change, it doesn't change the person we are, right? However, on the other hand, there are some changes we go through, and as a result, we may completely be destroyed. Like, some people say death, permanently losing your memory, having your brain replaced neuron by neuron with, let's say silicon chips, right? Or having your brain transplanted into someone else's body, right? So that is the question. We want to know what is the thing that makes the person we are, and then we will see whether or not that thing can survive uh, some fundamental changes, or what kind of changes. In this particular case, we want to know death as a very important, definite change in one's life, whether or not that X can survive this particular change that is our bodily death, right? Before I explain, different theories of personal identity, I want to make a distinction between two types of identity in this context. What we mean by identity. So there are two types of identity. Sometimes we say something is numerically identical to someone else. For example, you see me right now and you rightfully assume I'm the same person you met last week during the meeting, right? So I'm the very same person. In that case, you say I'm numerically identical to myself, to the person you met last week, right? But now imagine I have an identical twin brother who, decides, show up, in our meeting. He looks exactly like me. But is he me? Is he identical to me in a numerical sense? The answer is no. He looks like me. Sometimes it's very difficult to make the distinction. You cannot, distinguish him from me. However, he's a different person. In this case, we say that my identical twin brother is qualitatively identical to me. So there's a difference between numerical identity and qualitative identity. Numerical identity, when two things, let's say A and B, they are numerically identical if they are one and the same object. Like, me right now, I'm identical, numerically identical to the person you met last week in this class, right? But qualitative identity is when, two objects, let's say A and B, they are qualitatively identical if they share exactly the same properties, like me and my identical twin brother, right? Now, when we talk about, personal identity, we are talking about numerical identity, not qualitative identity. When we say whether or not we survive our bodily death, we want to know whether or not I, the person, the very same person you see right now, whether or not this person, not someone very similar to me, not the cloning version of me, but me, whether or not this person survives the bodily death, right? So keep this in mind. Let's talk about the first theory of personal identity. This theory is called the soul theory. What is the soul theory? The soul theory is based on the assumption that we have a soul, and that soul is a defining characteristic of me, right? I have a soul, and my identity should be defined in terms of my soul. So soul theory has two different parts. One part says person A and B, they are numerically identical if and only if the first one has the same soul as the second one, right? So in other words, if you, according to this theory, what makes me the same person you met last week, it is because we share the same soul. And second part, as long as I have this same soul, I remain the same person. So to continue existence of a person consists solely in the continued existence of the soul, right? So as long as I can, preserve this soul, I remain the same person. This is called the soul theory, right? Now, of course, there is a difficult question what this soul is. There are different, accounts of soul, but the most common uh, theory of soul or definition of soul, which is accepted by many religions, it is called the Cartesian conception of soul. What is the Cartesian conception of soul? According to this view, soul is a non-physical substance which is distinct, separate, and independent from the body. It's called sometimes substance dualism. That is, human being, for example, has two important parts. One is the body we have. The other one is the soul. Body is, a physical object we can see, we can touch, we can smell. But soul is a purely non-physical entity that cannot be touched, cannot be, you cannot taste it, you cannot, smell it or anything of that sort. And the soul's existence is independent of your body. So think of it like this. Let's say you have a bird in a cage, right? So this combination composed of two parts, the cage and a bird inside the cage, right? In this case, the cage represents our body, and the bird inside the cage represents our soul, which is completely different and independent of the cage. For now, the bird is trapped within this cage, but when you open the door of the cage, the bird can, you know, fly and comes out of the cage, right? So the analogy suggests the soul is somehow uh, inhabited in our body, right? And as soon as we die, this body releases the soul, and the soul continues its own existence. Now, if I define my personal identity, my identity is defined in terms of my soul, and if the existence of my soul is independent of the existence of my body, what does it mean? It means after my bodily death, and after my body is totally decomposed, my soul can survive. And that means uh, I can survive my bodily death. So my life in the form of that soul, independent soul, that continues its own existence after the bodily death is possible. So if you grant the soul theory as your theory of identity, life after death is possible, right? That soul does the bodily death does not destroy that soul, because that soul, by definition, is a non-physical entity completely independent of our body, right? And if our body, due to death, is completely destroyed, it wouldn't affect the soul, and the soul can continue its own existence. And since we are identical to our souls, as long as this soul exists, we can exist as well. Let me ask you some questions. When you came to this room today, you saw me. You guys, recognize me. But how did you recognize me? How did you know that I was the same person you met last week? According to this theory, in order to make that recognition, you need to make sure that the soul I have today is the same as the one I had last time. Can you see my soul? Did you see my soul last time? By definition, you can, because it is a non-physical object and it cannot be perceived through our senses. That's the definition of soul, right? At least Cartesian soul. So remember, we are not denying the existence of soul. We want to know whether or not soul, the existence of soul, referring to soul, is a good theory of personal identity. That's the question. So by definition, given the Cartesian definition of soul as a purely non-physical object, which is entirely independent of human body for its own existence, you cannot see my soul. And you couldn't see my soul last week. And therefore, there is no way for you to compare my soul today with my soul last week to decide whether or not they are the same. So if you cannot perceive my soul, and therefore, if you cannot compare my soul in different times, there is no way for you to know I am the same person you met last week. In order to know whether or not I'm the same person, you need to make sure I have the same soul. That is the criterion based on which we identify people, given this theory. Remember, the first premise says person A and person B, they are numerically identical if and only if A has the same soul as B. So if you want to say A is identical to B, you need to say A's soul is identical to B's soul, right? If you cannot make that connection, then you cannot say A is the same as B. A is numerically identical to B. So in order to make that, identity claim, you need to make sure these two people, the person you are seeing right now and the person you saw last week, they have the same soul. But if you have no access to my soul, how can you make that judgment? And if you cannot make that judgment, how do you know that I'm the same person you met last week? Let's modify this, soul theory. And we say, look, the only way we can have access to soul is through, let's say, our bodies or physical or behaviors and so on, right? I behave in a certain way. You hear my voice, you see my appearances, and I behave in a certain way. And based on that, you decide, since the bodily figures and the behavioral patterns, they are the same, therefore it is a sign that the soul behind this person is the same, right? So that's the modified version. I do not have direct access to your soul, but based on some indications, some signs, for example, your physical appearances, your behavior patterns, I can use them as a sign that indicates your soul. And if these signs, they are the same, therefore I can deduce that I'm dealing with the same soul. Now, let me give you an analogy. Let's say, I like, there's a very, tasty chocolate that I like it very much, right? And it has different flavors. And these chocolates, they are wrapped into, papers with different colors, right? Based on my previous experiences, anytime the color of this, paper wrap is, let's say, brown, I know it's chocolate. If it is purple, I know it is, strawberry taste, and so on, right? So next time when, let's say, someone, offers me some of these chocolates, and I love strawberry, so as soon as I see the purple, wrap, I say, okay, I want this one. And I taste it, and it tastes, like, strawberry chocolate, right? So in other words, in this case, the appearance, the wrap, the color of this wrap indicates the inside, the content behind the wrap, right? So it is very much similar like this one. The appearances, that is my physical appearances and my behavioral pattern, it's like that colored, wrap that, if next time you see these appearances and the same behavioral pattern, that indicates that there is the same content, the same soul behind it, right? So this specific wrap indicates specific type of chocolate. This specific body and behavioral pattern specifies the same soul. Make sense? But there's a problem with this analogy, right? The problem is this, sometimes I have to unwrap some of this chocolate. I need to try it several times. And then let's say for the second time, then without, opening, unwrapping the chocolate, based on the appearances, I can decide what kind of chocolate it is. But if soul is, completely immaterial and beyond our senses, there is no way for you to unwrap me at least once to see the soul behind it. And next time I see the same wrap, say, okay, that's good enough. I know the soul behind it is the same. So in other words, in order to make that comparison, you need to experience both the color wrapped and the chocolate, and then connect them. And anytime you see the first one in the future, you can deduce the existence of the second one. So if soul is, non-physical, then you cannot, draw that connection. This argument works like this. If soul theory is true, then I can never know that I'm dealing with the same person from one moment to another. Why? Because I need to perceive that person's soul and compare that soul at T1 to the other soul at T2. And since soul is not accessible to my senses in any way, therefore I am not able to identify people. That's the first premise. However, as we all intuitively believe, we often do know that we are dealing with same person from one moment to another. So if that's the case, the logic says this is called modus tollens. If P, then Q. Q is not the case, therefore P is not the case. That is, we have to say ST is false. Now, remember, when we say ST is false, soul theory is false, you're not saying soul does not exist. We are saying soul cannot be used as a foundation for personal identity. Because the way we identify people is not by, pointing to their souls and comparing, person's souls in different times, because soul is behind our access. So there is another problem with this soul theory. We have, our brain has two different, hemispheres, and they are connected with a bundle of, fibers, neurons, like a bridge, connect these two hemispheres, right? So they can work together, and they can know what the other half is doing, right? Now, in some cases, you can actually cut this bridge, right? In that case, you disconnect these two hemispheres, right? And the left one doesn't know what the right one is doing, and vice versa, right? So, in other words, by cutting that bridge, suddenly you're creating two different centers of consciousness, right? Now, in many cases, first of all, when we talk about person in this context, we mean a being who has consciousness, self-consciousness, right? That is what makes us a person, having the consciousness. But it seems in this case, when you cut that bridge between these two hemispheres, suddenly we have two separate centers of consciousness, or at least potentially two separate centers of consciousness, right? Does it mean we have two people? Let's say my left hemisphere is damaged, irreversibly damaged. I completely lose that hemisphere, right? I still can survive, and my right hemisphere can learn things used to be done by the left side, right? So I can survive with only one half of my brain. So that means, these two brains, they can function independently. So potentially, by cutting the connection, you divide them in two different, when they are connected, they work together. They work as a one unified center of consciousness. So we have one unified person here, and according to the soul theory, we have one soul because there's one person. But as soon as you disconnect, you cut that, bridge, now we have, potentially at least, we have two centers of consciousness. They can function, and in many cases, they do function independently. Now, if you have two different centers of consciousness, does it mean my soul divided in two different souls, like an amoeba, right? So the soul theory, the Cartesian says, soul is simple, and it cannot be divided, right? So there's a problem with this soul theory here as well. Now, so the point I'm trying to make is this. whether or not soul actually exists, the personal identity cannot be based on the existence of soul, because soul, if it exists, and if the Cartesian view of soul is plausible, then soul is beyond our access. And if personal identity defined in terms of soul, there is no way for us to identify people in different moments. While we do know about people, we do identify people. And if that's the case, the personal identity is not based on the soul theory. So we have to come up with different theories. Now, but if soul theory were true, then we would have a ground based on which uh, life after death would be possible, right? So, so we need to try to find a different, theory of personal identity, and then see whether or not, given that theory of personal identity, life after death is possible.